On this episode, we talked to Eytan Zweig of the University of York about semantics and pragmatics. So really going beyond just grammar and really getting deep into the meaning. So it's kind of a difficult topic at first, but definitely worth thinking about. Plurals seem pretty straightforward, right? Well, we'll see. Also things like the distinction between quantifiers in English and different language. This is where we really get deeper into the language that we are teaching. We're talking about semantics and pragmatics.
Yes.
So from a beginner's point of view, what are they?
Well, semantics and pragmatics are names given to two different components of the study of meaning of language, and actually meaning beyond language, but normally with the meaning of language. And one way to think about it, one kind of way that's easy to think about it, is semantics is the study of the literal meaning of words and sentences, and pragmatics is the study of the meaning beyond the literal meaning and the meaning of the use of the language.
All right, can you give some quick examples?
Yes, well, I think, the kind of examples that normally... So if I say a sentence, so if we are sitting at a table and having a meal and I say, could you pass me the salt? Literally, I'm asking you a question about your ability to pass me the salt. And that is what the semantics will tell you. I'm saying that's the semantics of the sentence, is I'm asking a question, asking about the ability to pass the salt. Any kind of competent user of English would know that that's not what I'm actually doing. I'm actually making a request for you to pass me the salt. I'm not, if you answer yes and continue eating, that is not a very friendly thing to do. So that's pragmatics. Pragmatics is the meaning that comes from the use of the language as influenced by both societal expectations, other considerations, cognitive considerations, lots of... the situation at hand. So, that's the difference.
And how do those two concepts interact?
Well, that's a very big and complex question, and one that is actually very controversial in the field of research. So there's a lot of disagreement about both where the boundary between the two lies and what parts of meaning should we classify as semantics and what parts should we classify as pragmatics, and also how they interact. The classical model, the model that I think that I teach the undergraduates and that I think is basically right, though it needs to be refined considerably in order to kind of get to what things actually are, is that words and sentences, words and ways of putting words together, be they sentences or smaller fragments of sentences, have a meaning that's part of the word, right? So when I say a word, the word salt, that has a meaning. When I say the word, a sentence structure like a question, can you pass me the salt, that has a meaning, and that meaning is inherent to the word itself, the structure. That's what semantics is concerned with. The moment we actually use a sentence in any sort of real life situation, it doesn't have to be even a communication. It can be when we talk to ourselves or think the sentence to ourselves, but any kind of context in which a sentence is actually being used rather than studied as an object of, somebody in class writing it on the board, then that sentence starts to interact with everything else in the world. Be it, the identity of the speaker, the identity of the hearer, the intentions of the speaker, what the attitudes of the hearer, and the society in which they live in, the context, and so forth. And that is where pragmatics comes in play. And one way to view this classical model is that the semantics gives a simple meaning to the thing, but this meaning is then used as a tool by us to actually express what meaning we really intend. Another thing of pragmatics that I didn't mention earlier, a case of pragmatics that most people will be familiar with, is things like metaphor or just using imagery in a way that's not literal. So another classic thing is if I say my brother's a real pig, he's not. But if I would say something like my brother's a real pig, you wouldn't take me literally to saying he's a farm animal, but you'd think that I'm trying to imply something about his behavior or manners or something like that. And that's a non-literal meaning would normally be taken to be part of the pragmatics. So the semantics would be he's a farmyard animal, and the pragmatics would be I'm not actually when I say he is a pig, I'm not actually trying to communicate it as a farmyard animal. I'm using that in a way that you, as a competent speaker, would understand, as a competent listener in this case, would understand what aspects of being a pig I'm trying to imply.
Right. It's not shape.
No, not shape or coloring or size. It's rather behavior or smell or something, right?
Yeah, I suppose expressions like the traffic was murder.
Yes, exactly. It's any. So I mean, one of the reasons that the borderline between the two is sometimes very vague is we don't really always have a clear sense of what meaning is fixed and what meaning depends on the circumstances. And there's a school of thought that says, well, does it really make a sense to make a clear-cut distinction like this? Because what is meaning other than how things are used, right? We can have a dictionary, you can look at the Oxford English Dictionary and it will tell you something, but often that will have both the real definition and a metaphorical definition as two different meanings, right?
Okay.
So you'd look at something and say pig, it would say something like, barnyard animal is meaning one, and then somewhere down the line, and meaning seven, it would be a slovenly person. So then you ask, okay, so is it now semantics because somebody wrote in the dictionary? That's not how these things work, right? So if we use something enough so that the metaphor becomes codified, does that become semantics? These are all questions that people are looking at, and it's not always easy to give a clear-cut answer, at least not as well, especially not when you stop looking at only one language, but you start looking at a lot of different languages and how things are used.
Okay. So, what's the difference in the developmental speeds, let's say? I'm presuming that semantics comes first.
Well, it's yes, but. So, I don't think it's really that semantics comes first, but I think semantics in some, well, let me give a caveat here. So, semantics, so when we talk about single words, semantics is relatively simple. You have to know the meaning of a word, and you know a word, and learning a word, part of it involves learning a meaning, right? So if I say book, then you know that it's one of these objects on my shelf, right? And you know that you don't need, that's just, you learn that at some point in your life, probably quite early, and learning the meaning of a word that way. The meaning that comes from sentence structures and things like that is a bit more complex to pin down entirely, but you still kind of, at least the relatively straightforward ones tend to, I think, also come quite early, at least in comprehension. So I know that young children can understand a lot, sentence structures a lot more complex than they can produce. So my daughter is 2 now. She cannot say full sentences yet. She can string a few words together, but she understands sentences quite well. And if I ask her, if I tell her, can you please bring me the book, she'll go and bring me the book. So she understands what I'm saying, even though she can never say anything as complex as that.
Okay.
So children can understand sentence structures very quickly. Pragmatics, on the other hand, is a lot less uniform, because pragmatics is pragmatics is a lot more open-ended. There's a lot of factors that come into pragmatics, and they don't all develop in the same rate. So I think children, by the time they learn to speak, they're very good at interpreting the environment. I'm not an expert on young children, but I don't young children's cognition, and I can't really cite studies, but by the time they're able to speak, children can interpret the surroundings around them, at least that they know what objects they can play with and what objects they can't, right? And they can understand, for example, so when I say bring me the book, they'll understand which book I'm talking about. So it's probably the one that I was talking about earlier and not a different one.
Right.
So the part of pragmatics that's just relating the meaning of the words to the actual situation in which they're used comes quite early. Children are also pretty good with things like with the people that they care about, which is normally their parents and other carers, and maybe as they go older, family members and friends, of trying to understand maybe not the state of mind, but at least the attitude towards the child. So they can tell whether you're angry at them or happy or sad or whatever, and they can react appropriately. So again, trying to kind of read things into to your tone and the meanings that come from how you're using a sentence. Am I using it angrily or happily? Am I laughing or shouting? That part of which is also part of pragmatics is also comes quite early. However, on the other hand, some parts of pragmatics require quite complex reasoning as to understanding how things go. So, for example, metaphors, especially the ones that aren't codified, but the ones that you just come up with in order to kind of relate something in the situation, might be quite difficult. And something that I know has been studied is something, something that the part of it I know best is, let me have a little digression here and you can figure out how to use it. Yeah. But, so something I've worked a lot on is the semantics and pragmatics of plurals in English. So plurals are something that seems quite straightforward, and people tend to kind of think, well, it's if you just ask somebody who hasn't tried to really think about them, you ask them, well, what does plural mean? It just means more than one, and you say, one child, many children, But if you start thinking about how we use them, there's all sorts of interesting kind of issues that go on. So one of the kind of interesting puzzles about the way languages like English work is if I tell you I have children, you will interpret that to mean that I have more than one child, right? So you say, so you ask, I have children? Yes, you have two. But if I tell you I don't have children, you don't interpret that to say I don't have more than one child. You interpret that I don't have any children.
Yeah.
So both the positive sentence and the negative sentence don't seem to apply if you have exactly one child. So I, for example, I would not say, because I have one child, I have a daughter, I would not say I have children, and I wouldn't say I don't have children. I would say I have a child. Now, why is that? That's not how negation normally works in English. Similarly, if somebody just asks me, do you have children, I would say yes. Even though I wouldn't say I have children, but the answer to the question, do you have children, is yes.
Yeah.
And this is true of English. This isn't just a point about children, it's a point about the word children, it's a point about how plurals are used in English, or specifically bare plurals that don't come with a number attached to them,
right,
or a quantity word. Another way in which plurals are surprising that's related to this is what's called a dependent plural, and that's when you have two plurals in a sentence. And an example of that is the sentence, unicycles have wheels. That's a sentence that's true. People accept it even though it's not true, even though no single unicycle has wheels. Yeah. Rather, what it means is something like, it's called a dependent plural because the plurality of the wheels depends on the plurality of unicycles. The unicycles have wheels, it really means that each unicycle has one wheel. In sum, they have wheels. Something like that. That's a simplification, but that works.
Right.
Now, the reason I'm saying all of this is because children don't respond the same way as adults. So there's been a study by Zauland, Anderson, and one additional author whose name I'm forgetting, and they did basically compared they asked adults and children to judge the truth of sentences of things like cats have feet versus cats have tails. And it's true that cats have feet, but it's also true that a cat has feet. But it's not true that it's true that cats have tails, but it's not true that a cat has tails.
Yes.
They found that adults answer the questions more or less the way I just did.
Okay.
But that children don't make that distinction. The children will just treat the plural the same way as the singular. So they would say that cats have tails, but also a cat has tails.
Okay.
So this is kind of long-winded kind of place to return to your question of the learning. When we then ask ourselves, the research then asks us what's different here in the children. Is it the semantics of the plural that's different, or the pragmatics? And the argument that the authors of that study made, and I think is right, even though I disagree with them on some other things they said about analysis, is that what's different here is the pragmatics. What's different here is that the reason that we accept a cat has tails that we accept cats have tails, but not a cat has tails. As adults, when we hear these sentences, we're aware of other ways that the sentence could be phrased. And when we think of somebody saying a cat has tails, we're aware that there's also the option of saying a cat has a tail. And that it's possible to answer that, and that's a more straightforward way of expressing the reality. And therefore, if somebody's saying something that's the less straightforward way by using the plural, in that context, it means that they're trying to signal something special, and we ask ourselves why. And there's all sorts of, I don't want to get into details, but that's kind of reasoning leads us to realize that I'm actually implying that there's more than one tail, even though strictly speaking, the sentence doesn't mean that. It just means that the cat has some number of tails. Right. But so under this view, the fact that plurals mean more than one really does not come from the semantics of the plurals, even though you'd think it does. It really comes from the pragmatics of plurals. It comes from the fact that we're using the plural instead of the singular. Even though the plural can be used to mean an unspecified amount, which might also include one in other contexts. Right. Children don't make that kind of reasoning. Children just look at the semantics more straightforwardly and answer it that way. Okay. So that's so what I'm saying here is children. So the semantics seems to come to children quite early as they learn language, at least at the same rate as they learn to do grammatical structures. They learn how to use the semantics of grammatical structure. At the same rate they learn to use words. They learn the semantics of words. Pragmatics is more complex. It involves varying levels of nuance, and those are acquired at different points. Generally, I think the consensus. So when I said children, this was done with, I think, 4-year-olds, maybe 5-year-olds. So children who are actually quite advanced in their speech, but still not, still somebody would consider rather young children. So I think by the time they're 7 or 8, children's pragmatics advances to the adult level, at least in most things. Other types of innuendo or something like that might come a lot later, but that has to do with knowledge, I think, more than linguistic ability.
Sure, other things. Yeah. So you'd mentioned before about how semantics is affected by identity.
Yeah.
So could you expand on that, group identity and
pragmatics more than semantics? So semantics is well. Again, one of the things that makes it hard to tell semantics and pragmatics apart sometimes is this question of group identity. And partially that's because I said semantics is the literal meaning of words, but again, where does literal meaning come when you have two communities that use a word differently? Right? So semantics is definitely influenced by issues like dialect, slang, register. All of these issues are ones that are not easy to pin down, right? If there's a community that uses a word in a particular way that's unique to that community, that could still be the literal meaning to speakers within that community. Pragmatics, on the other hand, is very influenced by matters of identity because, again, pragmatics is about how we use language, and how we use language relates very much to who we are and who we are talking to. We all use different registers in a day-to-day life. We all talk in different kind of levels of formality, different levels of respect, different levels of issues. I'm not talking to you right now the same way I would, talk to my wife or to my daughter or to a total stranger I meet in the street, right? It's every conversation. In every conversation, a speaker makes adjustments based on how they perceive the conversation, and that affects word use. But it also affects. So that affects lots of things like word choice, accent. Maybe for people who are, I'm very bad at controlling my accent, but some people are pretty good. So my father, for example, who's originally from Australia, sounds very Australian when he's talking to other Australians. He does not sound Australian at all when he talks to other English speakers. Because what pragmatics happens is not just the choices of which words we use and how we say them, but how we interpret things, how we, what level of politeness we expect, right? So I gave the example of, can you pass me the salt, right? That's a polite way. So our society tells us that's a polite way to ask somebody salt, because it's not polite in our society to ask people to tell people directly to do things, or even ask them directly, right? There's a scale of politeness that has can you pass me the salt, please? Would probably be the most polite. Pass me the salt, please is less polite, but still somewhat polite. Pass me the salt is even less polite, right?
Right.
Salt is less, But all of those kind of different ways of saying something are telling you to say the same thing, and you'd interpret them in the same thing, but you might interpret other things like social nuance. Right? If I just say salt, you might be quite annoyed with me if it was in a restaurant or we're casual acquaintances. But if we're friends and we're just at a casual dinner table and we're both munching things while playing computer games on our phones,
right,
that might be sufficient. So what I'm saying is basically, I don't think I'm quite on top answering your question, but what I am saying is that identity. I don't know that identity directly affects pragmatics so much as identity informs the social situation which affects semantics. Pragmatics, sorry. Yeah. Another thing that has to do with identity, but I don't think that's in the way you meant it, is simply questions of, interpreting words like pronouns and things like that that just refer to different contexts, and you need to keep track of who the people you're talking to are, right? You need to keep track of who to use a first-person pronoun versus a second-person pronoun versus a third-person pronoun. In English, it's relatively straightforward. Some languages make distinctions that are a lot more subtle and or socially significant. So if you have honorifics, for example, or not. So in French, if you say tu or vous as a second person, has a lot more importance socially than it might. And again, that could relate to identity, and it relates to what layers of meaning you interpret beyond the literal use of the word.
Yeah, right. So you're a bilingual individual?
I am, yes.
Yeah, your first language is?
Well, you wouldn't know from my accent, but English.
English?
I have a rather odd language background in that, well, I don't know how unusual it is, but it is not, it's not straightforward in that I was born in England while my father's Australian, my mother's Israeli. My father went to England to do his PhD, and I was born while here.
Okay.
So I spoke mostly English for the first 2-3 years of my life, then went to Israel back when my parents returned to Israel. Spoke English at home and Hebrew everywhere else for the next 20 years or so.
Right.
So my accent is very much informed by some of my Israeli accent, though, even though it's not, I've been told it's not very strongly Israeli, but it's, so my accent is very much non-English, but but it is my first language technically. Yeah.
But are there any semantic, pragmatic differences you can tell us about?
Well, yes, though. There are some. English and Hebrew are surprisingly similar in a lot of semantic pragmatic ways. Hebrew in general, for all that it's not a European language, is very close to European languages in its semantics and pragmatics, especially modern Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is different, but I don't speak it. There are differences, but they tend to be quite subtle, and they tend to be, though this might be of interest to you and your listeners with TESOL thing. I mean, a lot of times the differences between languages are subtle. It's in semantics, and that's one of the issues that make it a harder thing to pin down than sounds in the language or the words themselves or grammatical things. So I'll give you an example of something in English. I gave you the example of the plurals. That's identical in Hebrew, so I can't say. But I'll give you an example of something else that I haven't worked on directly, but I am interested in. Is the question of what's called universal quantifiers in English. So universal quantifier is a word like every that refers to basically everyone in a group. That's why it's called universal. Now, English has a variety of ways of expressing this idea. So we can say, every book on my shelf. You can say each book on my shelf. You can say all the books on my shelf. You can even though this is not very common, you can say all books on my shelf without a the. And you can say also all of the books on the shelf. Each of those means something that's similar but subtly different than the other. And it's very hard to pin down. I mean, there's a lot of people trying to pin down the differences between these things. And while there's some differences that are well studied and researched, there isn't a clear definition of why exactly each of them works the way it is. So, for example, one difference between the word all and the word, or at least all the, and the word every, is that all the allows so when you talk about something like, so let's say every student versus all the students, every student requires you to, the sentence predicate is something that applies to each student individually. So every student, so you can say every student is smart, every student is tall, every student showed up today, but you can't say every student surrounded the building, because that implies that you have a very small building or very big students, right? You can say all the students surrounded the building, by which you mean there's a big circle of all the students around the building. Right? So all allows students, so every requires students what's called distributive, that's a technical term, is it requires statements to be made about each student individually. All the students allows what's called collective meanings, which is when you talk about the students as a group. We have words in English that only apply to collectively. So one example is gather. So you can say all the students gathered in the yard, but not every student gathered in the yard. And you can interpret things differently. So another case is if I say every student wrote an essay, then you interpret the fact that there's as many essays as many students. But if you say all the students wrote an essay, maybe they all wrote one essay together. Maybe it was a group assignment. Okay. So, or even that would be acceptable if there's 20 students and they were in 5 groups of 4, so there's 5 essays, right? So you have this. So in English we make this distinction between different types of universal quantifier words, as to not just that they refer to the whole group, but how they refer to it. Do they get the group as individuals or as group? The distinction between every and each is a bit trickier, but there's a sense which is very hard to pin down, that each is even more distributive than every. And what does that mean is not something I can answer. One additional thing that happens in English is that we have words like everyone. Now, even though everyone includes the word every inside of it, it actually acts like all. So if I can easily say everyone gathered in the yard, everyone surrounded the building, everyone wrote an essay, to mean that they all collaborated to write an essay. Why is that? I do not know. That's a mystery, and it's something to do, and it's something that I know people have studied, but as far as I know, nobody has an answer to why. It's some people have partial answers to how this works, or to explain, which words would act one way or another.
Right.
All this is to say that in English, then we have all these different ways of expressing this idea of universality. Hebrew also has different ways of expressing the idea of universality, but they're not the same.
Okay.
Most important is Hebrew doesn't have any word that means every or each. It only has a word that means all. And it can be used in different ways, but it can be used in different ways that don't match entirely to the English. And I won't get into examples because I think I'm already being long-winded. But this is an example of a difference between languages, and I think it's an interesting example because it's not the kind of thing that I think a speaker would ever think of either. And as a bilingual speaker, I never thought of it until I started studying it.
Right, yeah.
And I think this is definitely the kind of thing that can get it can get in the way of, maybe not of people learning the language, but of people using the language in a native way. Because I don't think it's easy to explain to somebody when to use every and when to use all. And it's something that we all do correctly, but we don't really think about, and I don't think it's something that's ever taught. And I wouldn't even know how to teach it, because other than just by giving lots of examples.
Right.
So I think it's so these are the kind of differences, and there's a lot of other areas where different. So I'll just name another area. I'm not going to give you examples because it's not my field, but how languages express time is different. So so I said the difference between so I said modern Hebrew works like European languages, but Biblical Hebrew doesn't. One of the ways that it doesn't is that modern Hebrew is a tense language, like English. We have past, present, and future. But older versions of Hebrew, medieval Hebrew and Biblical Hebrew, were aspect languages. So it made a distinction, like you have in Slavic languages, between perfectives, imperfectives, progressives, and not a distinction between past, present, and future. So Slavic languages have both. And what's interesting about Hebrew is that the same forms basically got co-opted. So the same words forms change their meaning. I do not know the historical point in which it happened, but so cross-linguistically, some languages have tense, some languages have aspect, some languages have both, Aspect languages tend to be tenseless languages that don't have tense, tend to be underrepresented languages these days. They tend to be a lot of Native American languages in both North and South America, Pacific Island languages, some African languaes, West Greenlandic. So not languages that are spoken as kind of internationally kind of very strong dominant languages, but they tend to be quite a few of those languages. And I know this mostly because I took a class in it while I was doing my PhD, and it's a fascinating area of study. But it's just one more case where different languages can express a similar idea very differently.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Incredibly interesting.
Okay, good.
And brain exploding.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.